So I'll go ahead and jump right in. If you would, turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we'll read a bit here in verse 1. It says, "Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted." If we skip down to verse 11 here. "Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall." So here Paul is teaching the Corinthians and us by extension that the examples set forth in the Old Testament are there for our learning. And they're there as cautionary tales as well. And they're described as admonitions to us all. So these examples serve to prevent us from making the same mistakes that the Israelites made. And of course, there's many lessons we can learn from what's written about ancient Israel. We don't have time for all of those today, but are there any lessons to be learned from ancient Israel, considering the time that we are in right now? So we're just past the Passover, and at sundown this evening we'll be past the Feast of Unleavened Bread and well on our way towards Pentecost. So are there lessons in the Old Testament from this same time of the year? Well, of course there are. And we know a couple of accounts from the time of ancient Israel that occurred around this same time of the year. So today I want to recall two accounts from the Old Testament when the Israelites were in the midst of this same holy day season that we're in now. And I'd like to see if there might be any lessons that we can take away from their experiences. And of course, we can't cover all of the accounts in great detail, so I will touch on some highlights here. But I do want us to recall a couple of accounts. Now, the first account, obviously, is one you're probably already thinking of, and that's the time of the Israelites just after the Exodus. So in Exodus, on the 10th of the first month, the lamb was selected for Passover. And I'll summarize here just a bit. The lamb was killed at twilight on the 14th day. Israel was led out of Egypt the following morning. And of course, Moses led them to the Red Sea. Now, some traditions teach that the crossing of the Red Sea perhaps occurred on the last day of unleavened bread. I can't say that for sure, but some traditions teach that. Now, a few days after the crossing of the Red Sea, Israel came to Marah in Exodus 15. And this is where the waters were bitter, if you recall. And so the waters were bitter. Here the people started to get thirsty, and they started to grumble against God a little bit. They're saying, what are we going to drink here? Why'd you bring us out here? And now we're thirsty. So, of course, God in his mercy performs a miracle by turning the water sweet and allowing those waters to be drinkable. After this, Israel goes on, and they camp at Elim, next to the 12 wells of water and the 70 palm trees. And on the 15th day of the second month, they came to the wilderness between Elim and Sinai. This is the wilderness of Sin. And of course, here's where the people got hungry and again started to grumble against God, asking, what are we going to eat? Why did you bring us out here? We had pots of meat in Egypt. We had bread in Egypt. What are we going to eat out here? And of course, we have another miracle. We have quail and we have manna. And so God is merciful again and provides for them. Let's read a little bit about that manna. If you would, turn to Exodus 16. Exodus 16, verse 4. "Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily." So if you read on a little further, you'll see that the people were instructed to collect 1 omer of manna per person per day. And that was to happen every day and they weren't to collect any more than 1 omer per person. And what they collected, they were supposed to consume completely. They weren't to keep it overnight. But unfortunately, some of the Israelites decided to collect more than just an omer per person, and some decided to try to keep it overnight. And so when they would awake in the morning, the manna was rotten and full of worms. And you can read that Moses was very upset with them because of this. And of course, we just read about the instructions on how to collect manna on the 6th day. They were to collect 2 omers per person on the 6th day, on Friday, so that they would have enough for each person on the Sabbath, because God was not sending manna on the Sabbath, and they were not to go out and collect manna on the Sabbath. But again, we see some Israelites wanted to go out on the Sabbath and try to collect manna. And of course, they found none because God did not send manna on the Sabbath. And this did not please God, obviously. And he said to Moses, "How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws?" After this, Israel arrives at Mount Sinai sometime in the 3rd month. And we're all familiar with what happens at Mount Sinai in the account. Now, Jewish tradition teaches that the Old Covenant was given from Mount Sinai on the day of Pentecost. I don't know that for certain. I don't think there's a way we can show that for certain, but that's what they teach. So this is a brief account of Israelites after the Exodus, on their way to Mount Sinai, kind of during the same time period we're entering into. So what are the lessons from this account of the Israelites that we can learn? Well, there are many, but I'll highlight just a couple. One is trust in God. God will provide. God provided quail, God provided manna, and God provided sweet water for the Israelites. But they struggled with this a little bit. They doubted what they would drink and what they would eat. But God did provide for them. And likewise, we have to trust God, and we have to try not to grumble against God. Secondly, I think we can learn that we have to follow God's instructions. We don't know better than God knows. The Israelites didn't know better than God knew. And this is something they struggled with. They thought, well, God didn't really mean just to collect 1 omer per person. Maybe I could sneak in 1.5 or so. They thought maybe God didn't really mean don't go and collect on the Sabbath. But God did mean it. God meant what he said, and he meant what he instructed them to do. The Israelites were supposed to follow God's very specific instructions, and that's something that we have to do as well. So those are a couple lessons from this particular account: trust in God and follow God's instructions. Now, I mentioned there were 2 accounts that I wanted to cover today. The second account that occurred around the same time of the season is the destruction of Jericho, which we're familiar with. So in Joshua chapter 4, verse 19, you can read that the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the 1st month and camped at Gilgal. So the 10th day of the 1st month, that would be the day that they select the lamb for Passover. And in Joshua 5:10, we see that while camping at Gilgal, the people kept the Passover on the 14th day of the 1st month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. And on the day after Passover, the manna stopped, and they ate the produce of the land, the unleavened bread, and the parched grain. And as they approached the great city of Jericho, that great walled city, Joshua is given very specific instructions on how to defeat that great city. Let's look at Joshua chapter 6 and verse 1. Joshua chapter 6, verse 1. Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and the mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all of your men of war. You shall go all around the city once. This you shall do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall come to pass, when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, every man straight before him." And these are very specific instructions. And so that's what Israel did. They followed these instructions, and Jericho was defeated. But God also provided instructions to the Israelites that they were to abstain from taking any of the accursed things in Jericho, any of the idols, and anything of value, gold or silver or bronze, that they found in Jericho. That was to be committed to God. They were not to keep it for themselves. And unfortunately, one guy didn't comply with God's instructions. So Achan, son of Carmi from the tribe of Judah, he couldn't help himself, and he secretly took a beautiful Babylonian garment, and he took 20 shekels of silver and a wedge of gold weighing 50 shekels, and he hid them away for himself. He hid them under his tent. And no one knew this but Achan and God. Well, God knew as well. So at this point, Israel is feeling pretty good. They had seen the great miracle at Jericho. They had just conquered that great walled city. And they knew that God was on their side. So they were pretty confident when they were considering conquering the next town down the road, the city of Ai. Now, the city of Ai was not very big. It didn't have a ton of men. So Joshua sent spies out to the city. Those spies came back and reported that, the city of Ai is not very great. They don't have many men. It should only take you maybe 3,000 men to take this city. And so that's what Joshua did. He sent 3,000 men to attack Ai. But it was because of that hidden sin within the people, because of what Achan did, God was not with them any longer. And the men of Ai struck down 36 men of Israel and turned away the attacking Israelites. The Israelites retreated. Of course, hearing this, Joshua was distraught, and he did not know why God was no longer with them. God had to tell him that because Israel had sinned and kept for themselves some of the accursed things and some of the valuable things that were supposed to belong to God, that this is why he was no longer with them. This is why they failed at Ai. But Joshua wasn't aware of who had sinned. He just knew that there was sin. And so Joshua had to cast lots to find out who among the Israelites had sinned. And that lot fell on Achan, son of Carmi from the tribe of Judah. And to remove the sin from among the people, Achan was stoned. And they took all that he had, the silver and the gold, the Babylonian garment, his sons and his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all of that they burned in the valley of Achor. And it was only after removing this sin that Israel was able to go again and conquer the city of Ai, this time according to God's instructions, and this time with 30,000 men of valor. So this is the second account I wanted to cover. And what are the admonitions from this account of the Israelites at Jericho and Ai that we can learn from? Again, there are several, more than we can cover today, but a couple of them. The first one is let God lead. The people at Jericho were led by the ark. They were led by God. They followed his very specific instructions, and they had great success at Jericho. We too have to let God lead our lives. We also have to guard against relying on our own human wisdom, which we know is flawed. Unfortunately, Israel let their human pride sneak in after Jericho. In contrast to what they did at Jericho, when they were approaching Ai, Israel did not consult God on what to do. Instead, they relied on their own wisdom and sent only 3,000 men. And lastly, we have to guard against allowing sin to sneak in, as we saw with Achan. Because Israel relied on their own wisdom and because of Achan's sin, God was no longer with them, and they were chased away by the men of Ai. And Israel had to correct their mistakes. And Achan lost his life for that. So as I wrap up here, we started in 1 Corinthians 10 where we read about how Paul taught that Old Testament examples and accounts are given to us as admonitions and as examples. Barnes' commentary comments on these Old Testament examples, and I like what he had to say, so I'll read it here. They were written for our admonition. They are recorded in the writings of Moses in order that we and all others might be admonished not to confide in our own strength, the admonishment did not pertain merely to the Corinthians to whom Paul was writing, but had an equal applicability to Christians in all ages of the world. So the Passover and the days of unleavened bread are a time when we're very focused on examining ourselves and removing sin out of our lives. And tonight, at sundown, the Feast of Unleavened Bread will end, and we know that the physical exercise of removing leavening will end as well. But guarding against spiritual leavening, we know, is a year-round effort, and it's a lifelong effort. And that effort is much easier if we remember these lessons from ancient Israel and the lessons they learned during this same season, which is trusting God, not in our own wisdom, and consult God and follow His instructions and allow Him to lead our lives.